Great, thank you. And hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's a true pleasure to welcome all of you to this important conversation hosted by Publish What You Pay. Publish What You Pay acts as the official civil society coordination focal point for the EITI Civil Society board members. So as such, we support the board members in delivering on their strategic priorities, on their policy-making functions at the level of the EITI board. And we are very proud to host this global conversation today. The EITI has been a key focus of Publish What You Pay advocacy for the past 15 years, and it continues to be a critical tool used by Publish What You Pay members around the world to promote transparency, accountability, and citizen participation in extractive governance. This conversation today will be specifically focused on EITI validation. Validation of countries implementing the EITI is an essential feature of the EITI process. For civil society, it constitutes an important opportunity to ensure that the EITI standard is upheld, that its requirements are met, and also to engage in a dialogue with other stakeholders on potential reforms needed to promote better governance and better management of the oil, gas, and mining sector. So with this in mind, a few months ago, the EITI board decided to undertake a review of the validation process to consider the structure and the timing of validation, including an assessment of individual requirements in the standard and how they are validated. So the board is now consulting with constituencies around the world on a proposed new validation model to seek input from stakeholders before the finalization and adoption of a new validation model, which is expected to be adopted by the EITI board at their meeting in mid-October this year. So without further ado, let me hand over now to Haley Rice, who will be moderating the meeting. Haley works with the Publish What You Pay Secretariat in supporting the EITI Civil Society board members in their roles and will introduce our speakers today. So thank you, and over to you, Haley.
Thank you so much, Elisa. So as Elisa said, the purpose of this webinar today is to better understand the draft validation model that we have in front of us now. We will also go over understanding sort of the timeline and procedure for how you can comment on this draft validation model going forward. So in terms of format, today we will start with a presentation. So let me introduce Cielo Magno and César Gamboa. We'll turn over the floor to them in just a moment. They will be our speakers today. César and Cielo have been involved in the drafting of the new model since October 2019. So they can help provide a window into the thought processes and the discussions behind the validation model that you now see. We will then have a question and answer session. So how this will work, you have a messaging button over on the side of your screen that Liam described. In the messaging button for all participants, you can put your questions in whichever language you are participating in the webinar. We have folks who will be watching this box and able to help translate those questions from French and Spanish, Russian or Arabic into English so that we can take those questions during the question and answer session. Please do feel free to add questions as you think of them during the presentation, or you can present your questions during the actual question and answer session. So we will take all of those questions in a block for about 30 minutes after the presentation. And finally, we will end with a brief overview of next steps. And this includes how to submit comments on the draft validation model. And at the very end of the webinar, we will send you a link for a brief survey about this webinar. So if you could take 2 minutes at the end of the webinar, we would really appreciate that too. So before we begin the presentation, I just want to start with a brief poll. So Liam, if you could assist me with this. I'm going to go ahead and read the poll question and possible answers in English. And we want to know, did you know that the EITI is currently reviewing its approach to validation? Is this something you already knew before this webinar? So your options would be a yes or a no. So the first answer is yes, and the second answer is no. And we'll give you maybe 30 seconds here to go ahead and find that polling button over on the side and submit your answer. Great. So Liam, I don't know if you're able to show us the results of that poll. Okay, so I'm getting mostly yes. So it sounds like quite a few of you know that this is an ongoing process. Maybe you have spoken to your regional board members already. So that's very good news. And we have a few of you where this looks like a new topic. So that will help us in guiding our discussion. Thank you. So without further ado, I would like to turn over to Cielo and César to go ahead with a presentation. So let's just make sure we can hear both of you. Hello.
Hello, Haley. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, César. Hello, Cielo.
Okay.
Hi, Haley.
Perfect. Thank you so
everyone.
much. Go ahead.
Okay, let me wait. Well, first of all, good morning, buenos días. Good morning, everybody. I don't know if you can see my screen.
We can see you.
Okay, thank you. So first, I would like to thank Publish What You Pay for organizing this webinar, especially Elise and Haley and the whole Publish What You Pay team. I think the participation of civil society in the whole EITI initiative is very important. And I think this is a huge chance to have direct contact between the civil society that are in the field and us, you know, the representative of civil society in the board. It's a good opportunity to discuss your comment, your suggestion, your question about this process of review of the validation model. That after 3 years of life, we are changing it. But also, it is a chance to explain certain decisions that we made as a member of the working group that lead this new proposal. Yeah, I think that this change of validation model has many causes. Yeah, has many factors. One thing is not only to a healthy habit that EITI as an initiative, as a family, try to review and overcome the proceedings, you know, time by time, but also there are another factors. Yeah, we assess in the 3 years the challenges and the lessons learned that we have during the whole experience of the implementation of the validation assessment. In many cases, more than 50 countries we assess in the last 3 years. And also we need to recognize that the last year the EITI approved a new standards in the Paris Global Conference. And also we saw and we have seen that in many cases that the cost of each validation assessment is high. So I think that there are many factors that produce this review. This revision of the model has been decided to make it more agile and in accordance with the reality of the EITI member countries too. Yeah. So that's why my colleague Cielo and I have participated in a working group that produced this paper that summarizes the most important changes in the validation model, and has been approved by the board, this paper, which has entered a consultation phase since June and this month, July, in each constituency. And based on this document, we start this consultation phase. That's why the Publish What You Pay has organized this global call to collect the opinions of civil society, to try to discuss your suggestion about this new proposal of validation model. Yeah. In some regions, our colleagues, the other CSO board members, have organized prior calls to facilitate and try to communicate this important initiative that is going on. And it's very important, at least for civil society constituency, to have at least common message for the coming months, but because we continue discussing the new model in this working group that we create in the validation committee. So we are going to use this PowerPoint that the International Secretariat made for the validation model consultation phase. We want to raise some key issues of these changes of the validation procedure. Also, we split this presentation between Cielo and I. So I'm going to start the presentation presenting the context and the background of this review.
And so, César, if
yeah.
I could jump in for a moment, for those following along in another language, you should have the PowerPoint in each of the languages of the webinar, and you can find it under the Documents tab as well, if you didn't receive it by email, and you can follow along with the presentation, which César will go over in English. Thank you, César.
No, thank you, Haley. So each slide has a number, so we are going to pass to slide 2 to translator can do that in each language. So in the slide 2 about
César, have you shared your screen yet?
Yeah.
Can you try one more time? I can see you, but not the PowerPoint presentation.
Sorry.
No problem.
Okay, I'm gonna do the same. I have some problems with to share the screen. I don't know why.
Okay, let me see if we can find a backup way to do this. One moment.
I can try to share my screen to see if it's going to work.
Please, Cielo.
Great, thank you, Cielo.
Okay, let's see. Are you seeing it now?
No.
How about now?
Yeah. I can see it. All right.
Okay. So I'll be the one to press the slides. Okay, César?
Okay, can you go to the slide 2?
Go to slide 1.
Slide 2.
All right.
Okay. Okay, so the validation process is an essential feature of the EITI standard, as Elisa said at the beginning of this conversation. It's also a tool to assess the performance and promote dialogue and learning at the country level, and to protect the integrity of the EITI by holding implementing countries to the same global standard. No? For this reason, it was very important for the EITI board to launch a review in order to improve this process and introduce a validation model that encourages the continued progress, reflects each country's priority, and enhances the impact of the EITI implementation, while upholding the integrity of the EITI standard. Also, the review was taken expecting to ensure financial sustainability, because it's a quite challenge to save money in this time in the EITI process. Also, the timely execution of validation, so to respect at least the expectation of the time of the 3 years that we expect that the validation process has to take, and enough resources for implementation support that for example, the International Secretariat participate and spend time and money to implement the validation assessment too. So this review was launched in October 2019, and a working group was established to support the validation committee in this job. Yeah? And as an initial step, the views of the EITI stakeholders were thought through a first consultation phase that happened between December 2019 and January 2020 through a digital survey. So from the civil society EITI board member asked for an initial suggestion from wider civil society stakeholders. Yeah. In this stage, we received 44 responses.
Cesar?
Yeah?
Sorry, can you just hold your microphone a little bit closer to your mouth?
Okay. Can you hear me better?
I can hear you. Yes,
okay,
thank you.
So we received 44 responses in this first stage of the review of the validation model. I'll try to explain very briefly some of these points that the civil society raised. No, the first one is the measuring compliance and impact finding from validation show that the country have made progress in the implementation of the EITI standard. No? However, some stakeholders expressed that the validation should better reflect the diversity of implementing countries' circumstance and the impact of EITI implementation to date. No? On the other hand, we see that the need to maintain consistent objective treatment across the countries has also been raised during this phase. Yeah? In relation to the resources and roles, the review of validation considers who undertakes validations and who it is resources, no? With a view to ensuring financial sustainability, the timeline of the execution of the validation, and enough resources for supporting to the EITI implementation. No? So there are a lot of opinions that express some concerns about these three issues. Obviously, it was very clear that most of the opinion wants that the countries has an important participation during the validation assessment. No? And also, obviously, that the International Secretariat should continue with the role of collecting information, but also to define clearly this role and the role of the implementation of the EITI as a supporter of the countries. Yeah. And the last one topic that we discussed in this first day, we during the working group we assessed the civil society protocol and how to try to propose a new assessment of the requirement 1.3 during this review of the validation proceeding. And obviously we discussed a lot in the inside of the working group. We started an initial deliberations on broad options, yeah? But we have to recognize that there are different controversies about how to assess the requirement 1.3. This is a challenge for the EITI, how the country have to implement the requirement 1.3, and I think that we continue discussing that because we haven't made a decision in this point. The next slide, please, Cielo.
And I think we're having some technical difficulties with the slides, so we're going to try to share screen via a different way.
Okay.
But you're on to slide number 2.
Stop sharing. Right?
Okay.
Should I stop sharing?
I actually can't see it right now anyway. So yes, go ahead and we will try and bring up that presentation another way.
Okay.
But Cesar, you're on slide number 2, right?
Yeah, no. Now we're gonna pass to slide number 3. The title is Progress to Date.
Great. So slide number 3, progress to date. Thank you.
Okay. About the progress made until now, as I mentioned before, the working group was established in October 2019. The public consultation in the beginning with this digital survey applied were held from December until January. And after this, based on this feedback and lessons learned from the validation undertaking since 2016, that is the current model that we apply now. We spent several months negotiating options for a validation model review between March and April in the working group with the other constituencies to develop a new draft validation model that will be presented today. Yeah? So this scope of the review reflects lessons learned from the validations, consider about the resourcing of validation, the experience in the implementation of both disclosure and stakeholder engagement, the transition to implement the 2019 EITI standard, and also the aspiration towards systematic disclosure and strengthening the impact of the EITI implementation. So as you will see in the presentation that my colleague Cielo will continue, there are great changes in the validation model. First, and a strong participation of the countries. That is a bigger change, and I think that the challenge for that is that the role for the MSG is to continue increasing in the data collection and the initial evaluation, but also the challenge is how to make sure that all the constituencies can participate in equal opportunities in the validation assessment. The second is the elimination of the role of the validator. So the challenge of that is that how to maintain the principle of the independence of the validation process to keep the credibility of the EITI. And the third one, we have a new way of measuring compliance with the EITI standard with a numerical metric that allow us to be rigorous about who is advancing or not in the EITI each 3 years. No? Okay, so Cielo, you can go.
Yeah. Next slide. Yeah. Next slide, please.
Yes, and one moment.
César,
Cielo, before you begin, I just want to remind people that if you have any questions as the presentation goes that you would like addressed during the question and answer session, do feel free to put those in the participants section of the messaging box. Thank you. Go ahead, Cielo.
all right. So as César mentioned, one of the main objectives of the review of the validation model is to improve the ownership, national ownership of the validation process. So one of the key features that we're saying is the focus on MSG ownership and encouragement of systematic disclosure. Basically, this feature is reflected in the way data will be collected now. The primary producer of documentation and data to support a country's validation will now be the MSG instead of the International Secretariat. Because if you would remember currently, it is the International Secretariat who would gather and produce the initial report for the EITI validation of a country. In this proposed model, it will now be the MSG who will be the primary collector and documenter of the evidence in terms of the extent of the implementation of EITI in a country. The other entry point for MSG ownership in this proposed model is in the outcomes and impact component. Countries are going to be evaluated based on the objectives that countries have set as reflected in their work plans. And also, if countries would propose additional targets, would agree additional targets, like for example, if an MSG agreed additional disclosures, that will be reflected in the outcomes and impact. The systematic disclosure processes will also be reflected in the outcomes and impact. And so we go to the to the second bullet point. Sorry. If you would remember before, we have a whole list of requirements under EITI. What we are doing here now is we're grouping these requirements into 3 components. One is a transparency components, and under this component, you would see all the disclosure requirements of EITI in terms of documents. The second component is the stakeholder engagement. And if you're familiar with hold on, I just have to drink water. Hopefully it's not COVID. Sorry, I'm coughing. So we have 3 components now. We're proposing to organize all these EITI requirements under 3 components. As I mentioned, the transparency component is composed of all the disclosures that we are requiring under EITI. So for example, disclosure of contracts, disclosure of data on exports, revenues, taxes, all of those will fall under transparency contract. Under the stakeholder engagement involves the requirements on governance. If you would remember, we assess the extent of government commitment, the extent of company commitment, the extent of civil society participation. So this is where we do the civic space assessment 1.3. And this is also where we're going to look at how the MSG is functioning, whether it's functioning well, is there regular meeting, how are candidates selected. So all these items would fall under 2. And then the third component would be outcomes and impacts. This is where we look at whether we have impact on policies, we have public debates, we have sufficient participation from community members, public outreach. Now we're going to include there also the systematic disclosures and some measures on sustainability, which Cesar would discuss later. In relation to, if you have read the proposed document, this PowerPoint is actually a very limited summary of what is really going on in terms of the discussion of validation. This provides an outline, but if you read the document, you can see that there are nuancing in terms of the proposal. So for example, in the second bullet, the civil society representatives, me and Cesar and I, are actually pushing for the inclusion of a 4th component. Because if we are saying that we want MSG ownership and we want national priority to be reflected in the validation process, we need the 4th component to reflect this agreement. Personally, the question is, so why do we need a 4th component? I can see several values in creating a 4th component separate to 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3 reflects the standards of the EITI. I'm hoping that the 4th component will reflect agreements in the MSG. I'm sure a lot of us who are working in the MSG would agree that there are situations where MSGs, fortunately, would go beyond the requirement of the standards. And by creating that 4th component, we encourage countries and MSGs to keep that commitment to disclose those information. So for example, if a country decides to cover FPIC or free prior informed consent in their EITI, I don't think it makes sense to just include it in 1, 2, and 3. I think it will be good to put it in 4 and let the country do its own validation on how they are complying with the agreement that they've set. That's one advantage of that. The second advantage also is it'll be a good feature to highlight best practices of countries, so we can see what countries are doing beyond what is required by the standard. So by creating that 4th component, we actually increased national ownership of EITI implementation. It's an ongoing debate in the validation working group on whether that 4th component will be included, and it will be good to get your feedback if you think it's necessary or the 3 components are already sufficient to capture that. The third feature, and I think this is also quite controversial, as Cesar mentioned, what we're trying to do is to make the whole process cost effective, or at least efficient. And the first to go would be the hiring of the independent validator. If you'd remember, in a current process, what happens is that the Secretariat will gather all the documents, produce the initial report, and then an independent validator is contracted to review what the Secretariat has produced. And then that review, the feedback from the validator and the initial assessment of the Secretariat is then sent to the MSG for feedback. The current design will now forgo the independent validator. And as I said, while this is an outline, there's still a lot of room for negotiation here from the civil society's perspective. From the civil society board members' perspective, we are saying that it's not, while if we are going to forgo the independent validator, we have to set up mechanisms to make sure that the whole process is still credible and independent, and that the reports that are going to be produced are free of conflict of interest. As I've discussed in previous seminars that I've conducted on this validation procedure, the biggest issue now is while the MSG will have a significant role in data gathering, the International Secretariat will also have a significant role in terms of reviewing the data. And it's a huge debate among us on how to make sure the whole process will maintain its integrity and that there's an independent eye that will review the reports that will be produced. There are different proposals that are pending now before the working group. One proposal is to create an independent validation unit within the International Secretariat. And this is to make sure that the Secretariat members who provide assistance during implementation will not be involved in the validation of countries. Some of you who may be part of the MSG would notice that sometimes the individuals in the Secretariat who provides assistance to us in the implementation are also involved in a validation. And we see this as a problem because there will be conflict of interest in terms of the objectivity of evaluating something that you're actually a part of in terms of implementing it. So that's one model. The other proposal that we suggested is to actually create a group of technical experts, like a peer reviewer from the region or the country that is familiar with the local context but can provide an independent opinion or assessment of the draft report of a validation of a country. The third proposal coming from supporting countries is to have peer country reviewing. So for example, it can be within a region, one country would, for example, Afghanistan would review the validation of Iraq, or it can be across regions. Iraq would review the validation of Myanmar, something like that. But the worry there is there might be tendencies for countries to just complement each other. And it's like when you scratch my back, I'll scratch your back. So the objectivity of really the objectivity of validation might disappear. But these are options that are being floated to make sure that the principle of independence and integrity are kept in terms of the validation procedure. This next key feature is also very important. If you'd remember the current process that we have right now, we have a deadline. After the third validation, if countries are not able to get satisfactory progress in all the EITI requirements, countries get suspended. But then in the whole experience of the validation, we realize that, of course, countries are in different position, they're different contexts, and some requirements of the standards may not be achievable overnight or even after 3 validations. So recognition that some countries may take longer than others to meet the standard, we are now removing the deadline, and we are now going to look at how countries are progressing. This doesn't mean that we are now removing suspension. Suspension is still there, especially if countries will be violating the 1.1 to 1.3 requirements of the standards. If government governments have no commitment to EITI, if companies are not supportive, and most of all, if there's violation of the civil society protocol. So the suspension is still there. If we are also not seeing progress in terms of implementation, we would also expect countries to get suspended. The last feature that I want to mention is now a shift in not just we are changing the labels of the standard. We used to, currently we have satisfactory progress, meaningful progress, inadequate progress. Now we're shifting to labels that would reflect the extent of compliance to the standard and possibly a numerical equivalent of these standards. Later we'll show you how it's going to work. But the key question here is whether maybe we should reflect on whether numerical scoring is indeed appropriate to measure some of the requirements of the EITI. A frequent question that I encountered in the previous consultations I did is, how do you actually assign a numerical value when you're evaluating civic space, right? So next slide, please.
And Cielo, we're getting one question in real time. If you could please repeat what you said about suspension. That part went by a little fast.
Oh, okay. So as I mentioned, the huge modification in this model is that we don't have a deadline anymore. Countries can continue to implement EITI and do progress in terms of implementation, but it doesn't mean that we are removing suspension. There is still suspension, and what will trigger suspension is if there's significant not only significant, if there's violation of the governance components of EITI, if government has no commitment in implementing EITI, if companies are not participating and supportive of EITI, if there's violation of a civil society protocol, and if the MSG is not functioning, then those can be grounds for suspension of country. Another ground for suspension is if countries are not progressing or not improving in terms of their implementation. So while we remove the deadline of meeting all the EITI requirements by the third validation, we will track progress, and we have to see significant progress in terms of implementation so that countries will not be suspended. So in effect, what we're doing now is incentivizing good behavior, hopefully. Did I answer the question?
Yes, great, thank you.
Okay, so, all right, so moving to the next slide. This is just, next slide, please. Yeah, so this is just a quick summary of what I've discussed in terms of the proposed model. So currently, it's the Secretariat who gathers a document and the data to support the EITI, the validation of EITI in a country. In this proposed model, it is now the MSG that is expected to collect the data and documentation with support from a member of the International Secretariat. Our suggestion is this person would come from the implementation team of a Secretariat. So that's the first. We are removing the external validator. What's going to happen is that now it's the International Secretariat's validation team who will do the assessment of information. And then after being assessed by the Secretariat, the information will be sent back to the MSG for feedback and possible additional information. What we are expecting here is maybe from the perspective of the MSG, they've collected sufficient information already to meet a requirement, and maybe the Secretariat would say it's not sufficient, go back to the MSG, and maybe the MSG forgot to give some data that are already existing that may change the assessment of one requirement. So this is what's going to happen in number 3. If you've read the PDF document, it also says there, and that at some point there's a proposal to open the whole validation process to the public, because we want to increase transparency also and accountability in the validation procedure. So it is not reflected in the outline of the Secretariat, but it's part of the discussion to actually open the validation procedure for public comment. So it will be good if you think this is a good idea to get your support on this so that we can continuously push this in the discussion of the working group. So after the feedback from the MSG, the report will then be forwarded to the validation committee for review and recommendation to the board. So in this simplified model, as I mentioned in the previous slides, we need to insert, or we see the need to insert additional requirement in terms of independent review. It's not yet reflected here, and it's a pending discussion. So if you have suggestions on how you think we can improve the credibility of the EITI report, we are going to remove the independent validator, we will welcome it, because this is going to be a continuous discussion in the validation working group. So I'll turn over to Cesar to discuss the next slides.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cielo.
Can you hear me, Haley?
I hear you, Cesar. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. About this slide about focus on implementation, I Cielo mentioned before, there is a challenge that not just to save money or to use efficiently the resources that we have in the EITI. The idea is that how to link the validation assessment and the implementation of EITI initiative in each country. So the model tried to integrate the validation into the implementation cycle. No? That so the resources that we are going to address to the validation could serve to implementation goals in each country. No? So the idea to integrate the MSG oversight work in a way that will support the MSG using the validation assessment is the focus that the new validation model wants to fill. Yeah. So the MSG will be responsible for the data gathering for validation based on the standard template, and this template will indicate the objective of each requirement and require and encourage disclosure elements of this requirement. So the idea is how to use the whole proceeding of the validation assessment, the whole tools or template that the board have to approve through the validation guide, among other tools, to use in the process of the EITI implementation in each country. So this is the idea to integrate the information and the proceeding of the validation assessment in the cycle of the implementation of each country. But there is a challenge, obviously there is a challenge, because while we want as EITI integrate the validation assessment, all the information that produced during a period of time as a tool for the EITI implementation in each country, we have the International Secretariat in a possible conflict of roles, because for one side, the International Secretariat support each country to implement the EITI initiative in its country, and the other side, the International Secretariat participate in the first assessment of the validation model. So we discussed that in the working group, and we consider that it's necessary that the International Secretariat has two separately teams: the implementation team that support each country in the EITI implementation process, and another team that can lead the validation assessment time by time. No? So the country team could support the MSG in gathering the documentation, identifying opportunities for improvement as part of the regular implementation of the EITI, and as part of the regular implementation support that the Secretariat has. And we have another team, the validation team, that will review the information, propose an assessment for the board review. So it's very important this point, because the emphasis of the Secretariat work will shift to pre-validation and implementation support. It should be very clear. This is one point that I would like to raise, and also the idea of this integration of the validation proceeding and the EITI implementation is that obviously the time by time the EITI is very is increasing, and complexity also, so demanding full compliance with the EITI standard in a short period of time. So it's very important how to deal with these challenges and how the validation assessment can help to the country to improve that, because this is one of the reasons that we identified the importance that the NG should be involved at the beginning of the validation assessment. Obviously, it could help, and this is another goal. This change could help, will support the transition to systematic disclosure and integrating the validation in the implementation cycle, but supporting the systematic disclosure in each country. The next slide, please, Haley. Haley?
Yes, this is actually not from my screen. Is it coming through okay?
Yeah, review support to assessment. Yeah, thank you. So it's very complicated. This part is we discuss a lot. The model is an open discussion. We haven't closed this point. In fact, we collect the concerns from many of these of you and the other constituents about how to assess, how the indicators or the nomenclature of how to represent if a country move forward or advance in the EITI implementation through the validation assessment. So so this concern was raised during the first round of the consultation phase. How the nomenclature work, so we recognize that maybe the nomenclature of current level of progress, satisfactory progress, minimal progress, is not so clear. The terms satisfactory and minimal have been found to be confusing, especially to external parties outside of EITI. And the term of progress does not reflect the fact that subsequent validation assess the current status of implementation, so rather than progress compared to the previous validation. So it could be confusing for each country how to assess using this level of progress nomenclature. So also we recognize that this current nomenclature did not capture the possibility of the status quo or standby country situation or backsliding. So we discussed how to have a new way to measure the compliance with EITI requirements, not using the level of progress. To clarify that with another terminology, we try to use the level of compliance. So to address these challenges, the validation could assess whether the country has 1, exceed, 2, fully met, 3, mostly met, 4, partly met, or 5, not met, an individual requirement assessment. So these categories would broadly correspond to the current level of progress, with the difference that the assessment will focus on whether the objective of the requirement has been met. In a similar way, the nomenclature for overall assessment could be simplified. Each component that Cielo explained before: transparency, stakeholder engagement, outcomes and impacts, and she mentioned a fourth component that we propose, could be assigned a progress marker, very high, high, moderate, fairly low, or low. No, we consider another options of nomenclature, but I think this marker could be good ones. Yeah. The idea is to have a level of compliance instead of a level of progress, with a possibility for numerical scoring. You see in this chart, for example, in the last column about the score, the idea to include a numerical scoring. No? So maybe it's complicated. And the idea is to try to avoid the discretionality of the constituency. It should be a neutral, impartial score. And I think it's very clear that we want to propose that maybe the requirement is not met would mean 0 points. And if the requirement is scored as exceeded, it will give 100 points. No? If in a subsequent validation, a country is found to have made progress on a requirement but not sufficiently to reach the next category, it could be assigned an extra 50 points. No? This is at least the model that we try to identify in this new version of the nomenclature of how to assign the score of if the country met or not the EITI requirement.
César,
this is a challenge. Yeah.
If I can jump in for a moment, could I have you try turning your video off to see if that improves your sound? It cuts off a little bit once in a while.
I don't know why I cannot turn off the video, but
I should be able to help with you with that. One moment then.
Okay, please.
Go ahead.
Okay, please, the next slide. Okay, the number 8 about the one topic that we discussed in the working group is about how to include some indicators to show the impact of the EITI, the real impact in the field, in the policies in each country. So one of the things that has a lot of support from the whole constituency is how to include a narrative that should be presented that they capture the impact of the EITI in each country during the validation assessment. No? So we identify these criteria or these indicators of effectiveness and sustainability of the EITI. And the idea how to link, obviously, the validation assessment of each requirement and to identify and to assess thinking in the result of the EITI. So we know that in the last 3 or 4 years, there was a huge discussion how to identify the impacts, the outcomes and impacts of EITI in each country. This is now open discussion now. But I think that we identify these at least 5 indicators that it will be great that during this call we can discuss how to feel with the content of each of one. And I think that, for example, we see for example, the EITI implementation addresses nationally relevant extractive sector governance challenges. No? So we are not thinking just if the country met the EITI requirement. We're talking about an indicator could also recognize the disclosure and other effort beyond the EITI standard in the extractive sector in each country. So this is one issue that I want to raise. Yeah, not just thinking just in the box, thinking in the EITI requirement, but we need to think how the EITI cause impacts in the extractive sectors, in the extractive governance. Also, the other indicators are the extractive sector data is disclosed systematically through routine government and corporate reporting. So this is another challenge that we have seen in the last year, that time by time each government, each MSG has to call for a licitation, call for a third agent to design and to collect the information to elaborate the EITI national reports. And there is no proceeding or templates or information that we can use year by year. And so this is a challenge that we need to overcome. Obviously, it's important that the extractive sector data that EITI produce has a strong connection with the analysis, research, and advocacy for the academia, civil society organization, think tanks, etc., and how this information that is disclosed could help to other sectors to improve the situation of the lack of transparency, for example. No? And the last one is about the EITI has enforced changes in the extractive sector policies and practice, and I think this is a key issue for our governments, especially in Latin America region. So I think it is important to identify at the beginning during the EITI work plan, but also in the process of the validation assessment, the idea is to identify how the EITI help to the government to improve the legal reforms or the policy framework to disclose more information of the extractive sector. No? And the last one is there is an enable environment for citizen participation in extractive sector governance, including participation by affected communities. I think this is an achievement that civil society representatives in the board could include this particular point, because during our experience in the validation assessment, when the international secretariat pick up the information in each country at the beginning of validation assessment, it's particularly weird, or there are some limitations to include the voices of the local actors, the grassroots movement. And I think that the idea to include that in the validation assessment is in a way to improve and overcome the situation that the EITI is not just the MSG, it's more than that. And I think that this indicator was a part of the proposal of civil society discussed a lot during the last 3 years. Cielo mentioned before about the free paradigm for consultation, for example, and we raised in the last 3 years. So I think the validation is opening the door to include not just the current members of the civil society in the EITI in each country, but also other members, like local communities that are affected in a positive or negative way in the assessment of the EITI through the validation procedure. I think that this is a good chance to raise that and to discuss maybe the challenges that we have if we want to do that during the validation assessment. No? I think that I have to pass to Cielo.
Thank you, César.
Okay. Thank you, César. Can we move to the next slide? I don't know if it's just my internet, but I'm not seeing the next slide in my screen. But while we're for the next slide, or if we are there, I just want to add to what César mentioned in terms of the outcomes and impacts, especially for those of you who are part of the MSG. We know that when we look at outcomes and impacts of EITI, what's happening is it's really just a documentation of whether we are able to translate our documents into different languages. It's a count of how many workshops we've conducted to present the reports, how many outreach and how many roadshows we've done, but it doesn't really measure outcomes and impact in the real sense of whether EITI is really changing the extent of transparency, accountability, and even governance and community participation in EITI. So I think this is a welcome development. One proposal that we are putting on the table is for the MSG to look at their work plan and incorporate a system of monitoring and evaluation to systematically document and assess the outcomes and impacts of EITI in a country. If we are looking at the next slide, this is supposed to be an example of a validation outcome. So I would compare again to the current system. We have satisfactory progress, meaningful progress, inadequate progress. But the current system all implies positive direction of travel. The problem with that is if we have a country that's let's say it's already satisfactory progress, and now it's regressing, then there's no description that would actually fit this country, right? And if we say progress, what is really the baseline? Are we progressing from the last validation, from where we were beginning the implementation of the...
Oh, Cielo, are you still there? Cielo, can you hear me? I think we might have temporarily lost Cielo. César, are you there? César, can you hear me? Okay, I think we might have temporarily lost our presenters. Please bear with us for one moment. Okay, our presenters should be rejoining us momentarily. They appear to have been kicked off for a moment, so please bear with us for just a second here. Okay, César, it looks like you have just rejoined. I'm accepting you to speak now. César, can you hear me okay?
What happened?
Okay, I hear you now.
Spell me.
So, César, we left off on slide 9, an example of validation outcome. I don't know if you would be willing to pick up for Cielo while we try to get her back online.
Yeah, so I think Cielo is talking about how we are going to assess the EITI standard. So first, we are going to put in the score each requirement, and then in this slide, you can see that we divided the requirements in 3 components: the stakeholder engagement, the transparency, and the outcomes and impacts. So we split that to recognize the same importance of one of these. And Cielo mentioned before that we are going to include we try to promote a 4 component that is talking about the beyond EITI, how the country, the MSG, not just met the EITI standard, but also to include how go beyond the EITI, recognizing the good practice or the effort that the government, the country made during the validation assessment timeline. So the idea is to assign a score in one of these 3 components and try to have an average of this score.
And César, just
yeah?
briefly, I think Cielo is back. Cielo, can you hear us okay?
Yes, I'm back. Do you want me, César, to...
No, go ahead.
I'm sorry. So yeah, what I was saying is, so instead of now worrying about how to label a country who's regressing, we've changed our scoring in terms of compliance. And on a question, as I was reading the messages, and there's a question on how we're going to do it and what do we mean by a fourth requirement. So, for example, if a country decides to include another sector, not just oil, gas, and mining, but let's say fishery, the report on fishery can fall on that fourth requirement. It may not be included if we decide to get an overall score, but it's still going to be reflected, and it's still going to be validated in terms of what the countries commit to do and what they've accomplished in terms of the deadline. So that's the idea on the fourth requirement. I think another issue here in terms of scoring, if you've read the document, is on the civic space. And this has been an ongoing discussion within the validation committee and even in the board. How do we validate the civic space in EITI? In the current draft, it says there that we're going to have a separate section on the overview of a national context. The usual debate is that the civil society protocol only applies to civil society engaged in the EITI process and is talking about natural resource governance. We would like to argue that the EITI process includes the whole value chain of the extractive sector. And when you say natural resource governance, it's not just EITI issues, but opposition to mining is an issue of natural resource governance. So we should include, as constituency who should be covered by civic space, all civil society, the communities hosting the mining in their communities, or even civil society who are opposing mining in their communities. But the question that we have to answer now is whether we agree that the national context also should be considered in the scoring of the country. This is a huge debate because, and I understand, even within civil society, this is a big debate because the question is, in our experience, there are instances when we say there are issues of civic space at the national level, but there are claims that this is not affecting civil society in the extractive sector. My hypothesis on why we have statements like this is because we worry that the government might exit EITI if we put too much pressure in terms of civic space, and losing that opportunity to engage government is worse. Because EITI has actually given us opportunity to engage governments and companies. I am quite optimistic that with the current scoring mechanism, where there is less threat in terms of suspension and that we are recognizing progress, and this is my personal view, that I think there's no danger anymore if we actually include in our scoring the national context. And in fact, it will give enough incentives for government to actually work with civil society on how to improve the democratic space in a country. And this is my opinion, and I think this is an important issue that we need to discuss. And I want to explain my position in this. While we don't see concrete harassment or repression in the extractive sector, there is an impact in terms of the chilling effect, possible chilling effect of a repressive regime at the national level. If there's repression in terms of freedom of expression, or if there are threats in terms of your organization being closed just because you're not compromising with the government, then that should have a chilling effect, and that could also encourage or result in self-censorship of civil society. And it's very difficult to document self-censorship. So later, when we have an open discussion, I think we should discuss it further. Next slide, please. So this one is a very simple slide. It just shows the changes in terms of how we validate country. As I said, in the current system, we have a deadline in terms of meeting all the requirements. The idea now is that as long as countries are showing positive direction of travel, there's progress, they will not be suspended unless they violated the civil society protocol, all the governance requirements, and if there is no progress in terms of the implementation of the standard. So that's the idea. We have not finalized the scoring, as César mentioned. So, but the principle behind this is to incentivize positive behavior. And then for the next slide, it's actually a summary of questions that the Secretariat formulated. But I would suggest that instead of using this, we look at the guide questions that we prepared to guide our discussion. Among the key questions that we put there is whether, as I mentioned, with respect to civic space, what is our view in terms of how civic space should be validated? Do we agree on the greater role of the MSG and the greater role of the Secretariat and the removal of the external validator? And what options do we have in terms of making sure that the whole EITI validation process is still credible? Do we agree on creating a separate validation team within the EITI Secretariat? And is it sufficient to make sure that the conflict of interest and in the conflict of interest within the Secretariat is minimized? Do we agree on an overall score per country, which will allow us to rank countries, or just keep the scores per component? So these are key questions that maybe we can focus after the presentation. So I'll turn over the last slide to César.
Thank you, Cielo. Which are the next steps? First of all, the working group will continue working. So during this consultation phase between June and July, each constituency has to pick up the comment, suggestion, question about the draft of this new validation model. And to bring these comments to the working group to define better the validation procedure, the new validation procedure. And then we are going to have a consensus on that, bring to the validation committee space to adopt a decision and to present that to the board in the board meeting in October. So we have 2 months and a half to do that. So we expect to finish in this July this consultation phase. And then we start the discussion in the working group during August and the validation committee in September to then to bring the discussion to adopt a decision in the board meeting in October in Oslo. So I try to check the question that are very interesting and important. I think the key issues that we try to present a new model of validation. Is not vertical now, it's more horizontal because we try to promote the participation of the MSG that wasn't a request for different MSG during the first phase of the consultation in December and January. And I think that this is a huge change. And I think as the questions show us, there are some concerns related to how to make sure that the participation in a balance or in an equal condition of all members of the MSG in the validation assessment is clear. Yeah, and obviously because there are like 20% of the total EITI country member that has some problem of governance in the MSG. So, and we understand completely this challenge that how in the validation assessment can make sure that the whole constituency, especially the civil society, can participate actively in the validation assessment. No? The second thing is about the validator role, and I think that's a good question. Yeah.
Cesar, I'm just going to stop you here for a moment. We're going to do a quick poll and then jump into the question and answer session, if that's all right.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for your patience. Okay, go ahead, Haley. Thanks.
Thank you both so much for the presentation, and Liam for sharing the screen as well. I appreciate it. And thank you everyone for bearing with us through a couple brief technical difficulties. So before we get fully into the question and answer session, I just wanted to do another quick poll. And in this poll, I just want to ask if you have been involved in conversations or consultations on the EITI validation review in your country so far. Is this something you have already done with your own regional board member, for example? So if we could go ahead and launch that poll, you will have two options. The first answer would be yes, and the second answer is no. So we'll take a few more seconds here for everyone to find that icon that says polls over on the right-hand side of your screen. And then, Liam, if you can go ahead and let us know what the results are. So, have you been involved in the EITI validation review so far? And the answers look pretty evenly split. It looks like slightly over half of you have already been involved in this conversation with your regional board member, and slightly under half of you have not. So that is good to know. If that is the case, we will definitely spend an extra couple minutes at the end of this presentation to talk about how you can give your feedback so far. I noticed mostly we did receive questions. We also received a few items of specific feedback, and it will be important to know how to give that feedback to your respective board members at the end. So thank you all so much for that information. Going back to the question and answer session, thank you so much for all of the questions that you went ahead and put in the messaging box during the presentation. Cesar, exactly as you were saying, a number of questions reached my attention about the multi-stakeholder group. And I saw a few different questions raised here. The first one had to do with capacity. Even if your multi-stakeholder group is working well, how to ensure that they have capacity to take on more responsibilities in terms of document collection for validation. I heard another question around MSGs related to what sounds like freedom of interpretation to me. Are we giving them too much control to interpret what the requirements really mean? And in terms of this question, I know there has been some discussion within the validation working group about providing guidelines from the board and support from the EITI Secretariat to ensure that everyone is collecting uniform information. So maybe that's something you can touch on. And the third broad piece of this question that I heard was, what about bad MSG dynamics in places where the multi-stakeholder group already has some trouble, or if civil society is sidelined or has difficulties with that dynamic already, what happens now? So if we could just talk about some of those questions regarding the multi-stakeholder group role under this new model.
So maybe I can start, and maybe Cielo, you can add something. So I don't have the answer of that, but I think that the good response of that is maybe that the International Secretariat has a strong responsibility to start this assessment in the validation proceeding, no? Especially the challenges that we have seen in the MSG governance in many cases. So we haven't included these kind of challenges in the draft. We discussed that, but we don't have an answer of that in the draft. So we can include that because maybe we need a pre-assessment, no? To assess the capacity of the MSG to lead the beginning of the validation assessment, that is to collect information and obviously to be part of this first validation assessment, no? That the International Secretariat has to produce. So this is my rapid answer, and I think that challenge is about the dynamic of the MSG. We saw that in the 20% of the countries has some problem of governance of that. So this is something that we need to include in the validation assessment, and that's why we put in the same level of the importance the stakeholder engagement. If you, as Cielo sharing the slide, you see that not just the transparency, the current transparency issues in the extractive sector is important, but also the stakeholder engagement that we include is included the governance issues in the MSG. So these changes to assess in a to pass the vertical to horizontal way is presenting challenge that is important to include in our work in the working group. Yeah.
May I add also, the principle behind this is that we want to increase a conversation at the national level in terms of how a country is faring in their implementation of EITI. So the idea that the MSG will now collate the information and do the documentation is to increase that conversation and also the accountability across stakeholders at the MSG level. But I totally agree that it's going to be a bit challenging in several aspects if MSGs do not have sufficient support financially, logistically, technically. That is going to be a problem. If MSGs are not seeing each other eye to eye and there's disagreement, the assumption of the current draft model is that they're going to submit something where they all agree. But as César explained, in the current experience in a validation, we find situations where one sector, particularly civil society, has disagreement in terms of how we evaluate specific requirements. And I think the current model has to accommodate that and provide an opportunity for different stakeholders to actually forward information that may not agree with the assessments of the other constituency. So these are very valid questions that have been raised within the validation committee, have not been raised, and I think we need to really address that problem before we change the whole validation model.
Thank you both. So what I'm hearing is that multi-stakeholder groups will be responsible for collating documents that respond to specific questions that are part of the validation itself. And can you help with any details on, for example, support from the EITI Secretariat, the implementation or validation side of the house, and any sort of rubric or framework of questions that will help them know what type of information it is that they are supposed to be collecting?
I'll answer that. Definitely, the Secretariat will be releasing some guidance notes on what documents are needed to support each of those requirements. And that, as we mentioned, the Secretariat has an implementation team. So, for example, in Asia Pacific, that's GAY or Dennis. So GAY will still actively provide support for MSGs in Asia Pacific in collecting and organizing this information. But at the same time, as we said, we want an independent validation team within the Secretariat so that there will be a complete firewall between the Secretariat that provides implementation support and a secretariat that provides validation support. But yeah, so we would expect the secretariat to produce and provide guidance notes on how to gather this information.
Thank you.
To add that we don't with the guideline note we're going to have a clear picture about the roles between the MSG and the International Secretariat. But I guess that in the future we can see that these guideline notes can put in order the functions and the responsibilities of the MSG, especially in the first phase of collecting information, this data gathering that they have to do in this new model. And I think that the International Secretariat has responsibility to put in order and to start the first assessment of the validation.
Thank you. So could you briefly touch on in what ways the new validation model strengthens validation? We've heard some concerns about how this might work with the multi-stakeholder group, and I'm wondering if you can help clarify in what ways this model is an improvement. What do you think is the most important strength?
Okay, I'll go first. Well, I think the idea that we want to incentivize countries who are doing well is a good approach. It's a good shift. Instead of putting that deadline that after a third validation you get suspended, addresses the concerns that countries are in different places and different levels, different capacities, different problems, especially in countries where we have shrinking civic space and a very limited democracy. Then we're not telling them that, hey, overnight you have to have genuine democracy in your country. But what we are asking now is a genuine commitment to actually show progress in achieving the principles that the EITI is advocating. That's one. But yeah, I also agree that the weaknesses that we have, the principle, another good thing I think is the principle that we want to increase or strengthen national ownership of a validation. But I also recognize the weaknesses in terms of transferring significant portion of the work to the MSG and the Secretariat if we're going to remove the external validator. I think those two things are weaknesses that we have. I am seeing, so there are strengths, there are weaknesses, and I'm also seeing opportunity in terms of how we're going to strengthen the validation of civic space if we're able to give a big push in terms of what we really want in evaluating country with respect to civic space.
I just want to add what Cielo said. I totally agree. I think that it's very important because the countries claim for that, the implementing country especially, during the last 3 or 4 years, how they can profit from the validation assessment. And it's true that the current model has some difficulties or limitation. For example, the participation of the third agent, the validator, was not useful in many cases because it's very expensive and they don't have any kind of contact directly to the MSG or especially to, for example, to local actors. And the intermediary of this process is the International Secretariat most of the time. So the idea was to sincere these roles that we are implementing now during the validation assessment. And I think it's like a negotiation, to change this vertical assessment to horizontal assessment to improve the participation of the MSG. Is the idea to include too the participation of civil society organizations, because most of the time not just the MSG space is the only way to participate in the validation assessment. And the idea to include, for example, specifically and especially communities affected is the idea to legitimize in an informal way the participation in the validation assessment of the local actors that they are affected by the extractive sector. So this is it's not a win-and-win situation, but this is a way that we want to include the participation, also the civil society organizations, the grassroots movement in the validation assessment.
Okay, thank you. So I've heard that some of the strengths might be trying to, as you say, include more of the local civil society at the grassroots level in the validation assessment. And also Cielo's point that this model is encouraging continued progress. And on that point, I just wanted to reiterate something else I heard that goes to one of the questions we received on suspension. I think there's still a little bit of confusion over whether suspension would still exist or not under this new model. And Cielo, if I understand your answer to this, you can tell me if I've heard this correctly. I believe the answer is that what we are trying to remove with this is automatic suspension. Under the current model, after a third validation, a country is automatically suspended if they reach anything less than satisfactory progress. And if I understand correctly, in the new model, we keep suspension as a possible tool, but instead of applying it automatically, we reserve it for situations where either a country is not progressing or a country has some serious problems, for example, with the civil society protocol, or otherwise is in breach of a serious part of the standard. Is that a correct understanding?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so the answer to that question is suspension still exists as a tool, just not automatically time-bound as part of the wanting to continuously encourage progress. We have had a few questions about the civil society protocol in particular. There's two questions I will lump together here. One of them asked if interpretation of the civil society protocol is still contested, particularly by companies and countries who are resisting its application beyond the multi-stakeholder group. And a second related question is, how do we measure this enabling environment requirement?
Let me try to answer that. Currently, there is agreement already that the application of the protocol goes beyond the MSG members, but we can look at recent decisions of the validation committee in terms of how we are currently interpreting it. We argue that that in the case of a Myanmar decision, we argued that it's not just the MSG, but also members of the coalition that are actively engaged in EITI that should be covered by the civil society protocol. Part of it, the Myanmar decision also covers, we also look at the EITI process. And one of the activities that was that we asserted in that Myanmar decision is a community protest against cement and a mine, and that because of those arguments we got meaningful progress on civic space in Myanmar. It was a downgrade from the initial recommendation of the Secretariat to get the country satisfactory progress. So based on that decision, more or less the civil society protocol is being applied to members of the coalition that are actively engaged in the EITI process, and activities pertaining to natural resource governance, including an anti-mining protest. What we are trying to do now in the validation committee is to expand it further so that we can include community members who are hosting members of communities who are hosting mining or at least opposing mining activities, and to expand it further and include indigenous people and the communities. In the Dominican Republic case, what we try to do is to include that in the protests against mining, because the individuals who are complaining there are not members of the coalition. Is that correct, Cesar? Correct me if I'm wrong. But the center of the Dominican Republic discussion is the the refusal of a company to discuss the opposition of the community on a mining in the MSG discussion. So what's going on there is that civil society is proposing to discuss what this company is doing in one area, and that the company is blocking the discussion of that issue. So we're raising it as a violation of civil society protocol on the ground of freedom of expression, and of course the discussion on issues of natural resource governance. So, in short, what's going on is it's a continuous progress in terms of how we expand the application of a civil society protocol. But we are hoping that in this new validation model, that we are going to be able to expand it and to also include or reflect in the validation the overall situation of civic space in a country.
No, just to add, just one correction. In the case of the Dominican Republic, the communities, the leaders that were affected by the repression of the government and the company, the gold mining operation, were part of the EITI implementation. No, this national platform. It's the same case of the Myanmar. And I think, as Cielo said, the working group haven't discussed yet how we are going to assess the requirement 1.3. This is an open discussion, especially Publish What You Pay and Monother allies going to help on that in the next months, in the coming months. But I think that the most important thing is that in the case of the civil society protocol, we have an open door. That is how we can expand the application of the requirement 1.3, the civil society engagement, is through the concept, the broad concept about how that the EITI have to protect the expressing views of the natural resources governance, as Cielo said. So we try to expand that in the candidature proceedings, and now in the case of the validation assessment. It's not a challenge because not everybody's agree on that, especially the other constituencies, but I think that we, as with Cielo, we try to make sure that we can expand this concept to include especially the local communities or the indigenous communities that are affected by the extractive sector in many of our countries.
Great, thank you. I'm aware of the time, but I'll see if we can get through a couple more questions here maybe. Just briefly, I've been seeing a number of questions on next steps and timeline. We will reserve a few minutes at the end of the call to go through specifically how you can submit your feedback on this draft model and what the deadline for doing that is. In terms of the broader timeline, I've seen a couple questions about this. César and Cielo mentioned that there is supposed to be a finished validation model for board decision at the October board meeting, which I believe is October 14th and 15th of this year. So my understanding is that the goal is to have a new validation model for decision by October. And as many of you know, there are two supporting documents that go with validation. That's the validation guide and validation procedure, and that these will also be updated to correspond with the new validation model in the coming months as that is finalized. César and Cielo, is that correct? Is there anything you wish to clarify?
That's correct for me.
Okay, so turning back to some of our substantive questions, we had one question about board dynamics, about the conversation so far. Are there any major areas of disagreement between the civil society constituency and other constituencies such as companies or countries at the board level so far? So that's one question I'm hoping we'll have time for. And the second question is, if we have no independent validator, this is something both of you spoke about several times. You raised several ideas of other ideas for how to have a second pair of eyes, really, or a group of people to somehow help confirm the independence of validation. So if, for example, you turn to outside reviewers, how can we make sure that these people, how can we ensure the credibility of these people? So that was a second question. Those are both somewhat big questions, but I'm hoping in the next 5 or 6 minutes, you could comment on both of those questions.
So maybe I can start very briefly. In the case of the validator and the elimination of the validator, I raised many times because this is one and a key feature of the validation assessment, that is the independence of this proceeding, to reduce the influence of any of each constituency, but also the international secretariat. So this is a tricky issue that is not defined now, but one way to make sure about the independence of the validation assessment is to create inside of the international secretariat a validation team, independent from the other implementation teams, and can work in this process specifically for the next year. But this is one way. Another way for me is to try to bring peer reviewers mechanisms like think tanks or some organization from the United Nations system to make sure that this assessment is neutral, objective, and impartial. I rejected completely the idea that the countries can review other countries because maybe it's not so impartial that that some stakeholders say that. So at least for me, these two ways to make sure that the independence of the validation assessment is clear. And the other question is about the discussion in the board, between different constituencies.
Right.
I think that the open discussion is about the requirement 1.3, as we said before, that there are different interpretations, narrow interpretation about how to apply the 1.3, and I think this is a big fight we have, not just Cielo and I, but also the whole civil society board members in the board, because time by time, meeting by meeting, we have to defend a broad interpretation of the civic space in the board, in each case. Yeah.
Cielo, do you have anything you wish to add?
Yeah, just to quickly add on what Cesar said. Yeah, those two things, the independence and credibility of the validation process, and of course 1.3 would be critical issues. The fourth component hasn't been picked up, but it's I really want to personally push it because I want countries to be motivated to add on and go beyond the standard to make the EITI implementation relevant to their country. And I can see also another trend of question in terms of the MSG. The way that we are discussing this is it's not literally the MSG who will do the data gathering. It's possible for the MSG to actually commission a consultant to do the data gathering, to document the information needed for the validation process, or they can add it as part of a scope of work of the independent administrator. So in the same way that the independent administrator produces the annual EITI report, the independent administrator can also be commissioned to collect the information with respect to validation. So that's an option that it's on the table also.
So on that note, going back to a few of our questions about the MSG involvement, in terms of financial implications for the MSG, is that anything you can speak to? Is that something the group has considered or that there might be support for?
That one has not been discussed. So I think we really have to raise it in the working group, particularly in countries where there's not enough support, financial support for EITI implementation, but that's a very valid concern.
And if we could take 2 more minutes for a final question on this fourth pillar. We've had a few questions about where national priorities can be, where we reflect national context that would be different country to country, and also a clarifying question of what the fourth pillar is. So I think all of those questions go together. Cielo, would you mind taking that one?
So the traditional report where we actually put national context will still be there. That's not actually part of the validation process. In terms of the fourth component, without the fourth component, the national priorities will be reflected in the outcomes and impact context, on the assumption that it will be reflected in the work plan, it will be reflected in your discussion with your legislators, it will be reflected in your outreach activities. So those will be the sufficient documentation in terms of prioritizing and reflecting national priorities in EITI. My argument for a fourth component is, for example, a country decides to monitor the compliance of countries on FPIC. So it can be part of your EITI agenda. It becomes a fourth component to see which companies actually reports and comply with FPIC, and if the country's goal is to make each company accountable for FPIC, your validation would look like whether you're successful or not in making companies disclose that. If a country decides to disclose all environmental impact assessment and it's currently not required, then additional environmental disclosure, additional social disclosure can be incorporated in that fourth component. So it will not, if we're not going to have an overall score, then that would at least highlight how the country is progressing in terms of the things that they agreed to add on to the EITI standard.
Thank you. So if I'm hearing you correctly, it would be a place to highlight above and beyond areas where countries have agreed to explore in their own national context. So yes. I regret to say we're running a little bit out of time, so I'm going to go ahead and move us on to some of our closing bits here to make sure that we all know what the next steps are and the timeline. But if I could actually launch one final poll, I am wondering, this last question, do you have a better understanding of the changes proposed to the EITI validation process now than you did before? So the three options for this would be: first answer, yes, very much. Second answer, yes, to some extent, more or less. Third answer, not really. I still have many questions or concerns. So if you could take a few seconds and fill out this third poll, that would be wonderful. And again, your poll button is on the right of your screen. So we'll take a few more seconds here. So answer 1, yes, very much. Answer 2, yes, sort of. Answer 3, not really. Okay, if we could please see the poll results. All right. Our answers are looking like most of you are in the second category, yes, to some extent. So it sounds like there may be some open questions and concerns still. Hopefully you have a better idea of what some of those issues are. We do welcome your feedback. As you can see, there are a number of questions that have been raised that have not been fully figured out or fully addressed by the working group yet. So this is a good part of this consultations. Part of the purpose of doing this is to help get your feedback on what you think would be a good way to address some of these or areas where you have further concerns. So in terms of what our next steps are, if you wish to submit your feedback, again, this could be suggestions, this could be concerns, we would ask that you reach out to your regional civil society board member on the EITI board. And we're going to go ahead and pop a link into the comments That link is to the EITI board. In case you are not sure who your board member is, you can check it on this link. So we have 10 civil society board members, and you can submit your feedback to your regional board representative. We would ask for your feedback by July 15th, so that is 5 days from now. This is a hard deadline. It's important that we respect this deadline because we have a second deadline to the EITI board to present this feedback. So unfortunately, that is a hard deadline. Do try to have your feedback in by July 15th, or we may not be able to take your feedback after that date. So again, 5 more days to reach out to your EITI Civil Society board member. I'm going to go ahead and pop that link into the participants box. So again, if you are not sure who your board member is, you can check that. I would also like to say, well, as a final note, first of all, thank you to the interpreters and to César and Cielo, and to all the participants. We hugely appreciate your time